Welcome, everyone. This is Laurel Miller from International Crisis Group, and we're about to begin. Thank you all for joining us today. Apologies for the short delay. We, like others, are experimenting with Twitter Spaces, and experimentation always has a little bit of a trial and error aspect to it. So here we go. As I said, I'm Laurel Miller. I'm Director of the Asia Program at the International Crisis Group. Today, I have with me Graeme Smith, who is a senior consultant for Crisis Group working on Afghanistan, and Ibraheem Bahiss, who is an analyst for Afghanistan with us at International Crisis Group. For those of you who don't know, we are a conflict prevention and conflict resolution focused nonprofit organization. We conduct our work through research, analysis, and advocacy aimed at improving policies related to conflict prevention and conflict resolution. We work globally, headquartered in Brussels, Belgium, but we're a global organization, and we've been doing work in Afghanistan for more than 20 years now. We have a new report that was published just last Friday that some of you may be interested in, titled Afghanistan's Security Challenges Under the Taliban, taking a comprehensive look at how the security landscape has evolved in Afghanistan over the last year and what the challenges are ahead for the Afghan people, for the authorities in Afghanistan, for the international community that is interested in how the situation in Afghanistan evolves. I'm going to start us off by having both Graeme and Ibraheem make some short remarks, and then we will open it up for questions. A reminder, please submit your questions through DM, through direct message to @Crisis Group, and then they will be fed to us here. If you do not want to have your name identified in association with your question, please feel free to let us know that. Otherwise, I am likely to indicate who it is that is posing the question. But if you don't want your name mentioned, that's no problem. Just be sure to let us know. People are going to remain muted. Listeners are going to remain muted throughout the Twitter space, but we will get to as many questions as we possibly can during the approximately hour that we have. Now, over to you, Graeme, with some opening comments.
Sure, thanks. It's a kind of a mind-boggling challenge to try to sum up the situation in an entire country, and sort of audacious, really, for a white guy like me sitting outside Afghanistan to try to sum up all the concerns related to that country. And I think that a lot of I've been working on Afghanistan since 2005, and there have been a lot of really intense discussions amongst internationals, especially amongst Westerners, about sort of what do we do next on Afghanistan and where do we go from here. And I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that these policy discussions and debates that we have amongst ourselves now are in some ways a little bit less consequential, than they used to be when there were more than 100,000 international forces on the ground. Some of the really big conversations are now happening, amongst Afghans in Dari and Pashto, or between the de facto Taliban authorities and interlocutors are whom their conversations translated, into regional languages. And so it's the debates that we have here amongst ourselves, in sort of Western policy spaces, are a little bit less life or death than they used to be. But still, I think it's very important that we've just come out with this paper on security. I think taking a kind of tour d'horizon, a kind of a sweeping look at the security landscape in a way that really I haven't seen anywhere else. And I think that's very important because, there is a risk that Westerners might fall back onto bad habits of bombing Afghanistan or funding militias and hoping that would sort of fix the security problems. So, I hope that we have humbly presented a few policy alternatives for the consideration of policymakers and for the consideration of the Taliban. And that followed some work that we did, through the first half of the year on the advocacy side, and last year publishing a report on the humanitarian and economic picture that I think did have some influence. We were arguing that the West, in particular, but the world generally, should help with an economic revival in Afghanistan. That it's not going to be enough just to dump bags of food into the country, that really some more fundamental work needs to be done to assist with getting the country back on its feet economically. And I think that work is still unfinished, which is why we'll probably do an update coming soon on the humanitarian and economic picture. And then I think also regionally, with a bit of luck in the coming months, Ibraheem and I might be able to do some more analysis of Afghanistan's relationship with the region, because I think, especially after the death of the Al-Qaeda leader Zawahiri in Kabul, you're likely to see more and more divergence between regional and international approaches. And so that is maybe a topic for further research. But anyways, I feel tremendously lucky in this work to be working with Ibraheem Bahiss, my colleague, who sweats it out on the ground and does, a lot of our, work, primarily inside Afghanistan. And it's really his impressions from the ground that inform us day to day. And so maybe we should hand over to him and hear what he's thinking and feeling as we approach this 1-year anniversary.
Thanks, Ibraheem. Over to you. And just a reminder to everyone, we're starting to get some questions via direct message, and people should feel free to begin to send in their questions via DM to @crisisgroup. Ibraheem, over to you.
Thank you very much, Laurel, and thanks for the great summary, both Laurel and Graeme. Crisis Group has kind of reestablished its presence in Afghanistan. Graeme and I made several trips to Afghanistan, where in addition to Kabul, we have managed to travel to other parts of the country, specifically the south and north, and we will continue to visit different parts of the country to gather what people are thinking and seeing and saying about the developments. We also have a number of researchers employed in different parts of the country who are helping us form a more wholesome picture of the country based on kind of our impressions, our conversations with people, Afghans on the ground, as well as what we are hearing through our researchers and interlocutors. Let me try to kind of talk about some of the changes that I've witnessed in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over a year ago. Some of the changes have been, some of the big kind of political changes that come to mind are Afghanistan has gone through a tremendous change in terms of a new political class has emerged. The Taliban are now the rulers of Afghanistan, and as a movement who had tens of thousands or perhaps even more than that when you count supporters, they have really overtaken the state machinery in the country and are now in full control of the government machinery in Afghanistan. The old political class has, some of them fearful of their lives, have left the country. Others are still in country, but haven't really been given any role by the Taliban in the new governance of the country. And there's a large segment of the civil servants that continue to stay in country and work in the government positions that they held before the Taliban took over. Another big change that I've noticed is in the media, and specifically criticism of the government. Under the old republic, there was a lot of freedom for people to be able to criticize the government, the performance of whether it was the president, the parliament, or any government organ. Under the Taliban, we have seen a lot of the criticism become more and more muted over time, and largely, from what we can gather, it's because of the Taliban's repression of criticism and the way they view criticism. Now, it's not to say that there is no criticism of the Taliban, but they have really they've adopted an approach of kind of differentiating between criticism. Some is seen as constructive, which is allowed, and others is seen as destructive, which is then people who do employ those criticisms are imprisoned or otherwise admonished. And I think the line is very blurry, and it's very difficult for people to know when they will cross the line. And it's created a lot of fear in the public conversations you're hearing in the media when it comes to people want to say things, whether it's criticism, whether it's offering solutions, whether it's venting their frustration. But there's a lot of fear in terms of specifically when it comes to the media and being able to voice their opinions. Another important change has been in the gender sphere, specifically with women. We have seen women in Afghanistan continue to face quite draconian restrictions in some cases. Secondary schools officially remain closed, although there are secondary schools for females, I should add, in some provinces. But by and large, the Taliban have not implemented the promise they made early this year that they will reopen girls' secondary schooling. In addition to that, females are, especially those that used to work in the government sector, many of them are unable to return to work. There are females in the health and education sectors, as well as in some portfolios in the Ministry of Interior, but by and large, women have been excluded and are unable to return to their jobs. In the private sector, females are working, but they're continue to face both persecution as laws that inhibit the ability to carry out activities. Females find it difficult to travel long distances because the Taliban have a decree requiring that they be accompanied by a male relative when they're traveling long distances. And when we speak to a lot of the women on the ground, there is a lot of fear, not just the Taliban, but the political change has brought about a change of thinking within the families themselves. Male relatives are often telling females that it's far too dangerous for them to be out and working. And the economic situation has really created a crunch on the economy. And a lot of the employers prefer males because they're fearful that if they have female workforce, there would be additional restrictions imposed by the de facto authorities, which would make it difficult and economically unviable, not viable for them to be able to employ female workforce. So it has created a lot of challenges for them as well. Lastly, let me end by speaking a bit about some of the common themes we've heard from Afghans over the past few months as we've spoken to Afghans both in Kabul as well as the provinces. Many Afghans appreciate the new security landscape in the country. Now, Afghanistan is far from violence-free. There is still residual violence, but as our report highlights, it's reduced significantly when we compare it to what was happening last year when Afghanistan was the world's deadliest conflict. And many people who last year would tell you stories of having their children or their family members hiding in basements because of their house was getting fired upon either by the Taliban insurgents or by the security forces, are now able to till their farms and look after some of the more mundane tasks of their lives. At the same time, I think a big concern with many ordinary Afghans is which way the country's relations with the international community is going. And I think in part that's to do with the economic strangulation of the country. Many people that you speak with, in addition to the famine drought that has impacted many farmers, when you speak with people who had businesses, complain to you that the customer base has shrunk to, in some cases 10% or 5% of what it was before the Taliban takeover. There just isn't a lot of purchasing power, and as a result, all the businesses are feeling the shockwaves of this. And many want to know whether this government will be able to accommodate the demands of the international community for relations to normalize so that the economy can come back to a level of stability and they can go on with their lives. I think these are some of the impressions I've picked up. Let me end there and hand it back to you, Laura.
Thank you both. Great introduction. I think you've both pointed to some important changes in the security picture in Afghanistan over the last year, in people's experience in society and the imposition of greater social controls by the authorities, and the dramatic deterioration of the economic and humanitarian picture in the country. We've got some good questions that have come in. Again, these can be sent by DM to @crisisgroup. But I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative of posing the first question, which is, with all of the changes that you have both pointed to, some of which quite rapidly and dramatically in the early days of the last year, I'm also struck by one one dimension of the situation in Afghanistan that seems to have evolved remarkably slowly over the last year, and that is the political evolution in the country. I mean, it's a whole year later. There is still an interim government in place. It is still fairly opaque how decision making is conducted by the new authorities, and it's also unclear still, I think, but I'm interested in both of your views on this, what the political direction is of the country. Do we know anything more today than we did a year ago about the trajectory of Afghanistan's political evolution? I mean, is the kind of regime that there is in place now what we're going to see indefinitely? Is there any kind of political ferment that you see there within the Taliban authorities? Graeme, do you want to take that first? And then Ibraheem, if you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. Probably as usual, Ibrahim will have more useful things to say, but maybe I'll just interject briefly. I think I saw that we had some people on the line here whose names I recognize from Doha, and certainly some of the friends I made, in Qatar during the peace talks, if you can call it peace talks. Some of those people, I think, had been hopeful that despite the Taliban's military takeover last August, that there might still be space for political dialogue that might even, pick up some of the threads from Doha and work towards some form of national reconciliation. There were certainly people in the U.S. government who were hoping that. There was even a sort of a concept paper produced by a think tank in Kabul that's associated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that has sort of floated this idea of national reconciliation. And there has been some form of outreach by a reconciliation commission under Dilawar, a senior Taliban figure, that has been reaching out, individually to sometimes very prominent people who were associated with the previous Afghan political dispensation, senior figures in the former republic, and asking them to sort of come in from the cold, as it were, to come back to Afghanistan physically and either participate in the new order, or at least to not be hostile to the new order. I think that process has been a lot more quiet and piecemeal than some folks would have liked. I was in Oslo earlier this year when the Taliban made their first sort of foray into Europe under their new regime. And some of the people who were sitting across the table from them, members of Afghan civil society, Afghan politicians, had been sort of hoping that might kick off a kind of a new bond, or some form of high level dialogue with the Taliban about how they might include people who disagree with them into the new political dispensation. And I don't think the Taliban had the same idea. I think their idea of reconciliation involves other people kind of surrendering to them, as it were, rather than the Taliban surrendering any meaningful share of power. That being said, it's probably good that the Taliban would prefer to shake hands with their enemies rather than slaughtering. But I don't see, in the near-term horizon, any sort of fundamental reordering of the, of the sort of Taliban share of power. But Ibrahim, I'd be curious about your thoughts on this, though.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, Ibrahim, is there anything we know today that's new, different, more detailed about the political trajectory of Afghanistan under the Taliban that we didn't know a year ago?
Let me come back to that question as I add to what some of the excellent comments Graeme made. I think for many Afghans, the Taliban's one-year rule has been marked by disappointment with the broken promises that the Taliban made over the past 2 decades. The Taliban for years, over a decade, promised that they do not seek monopoly of power in Afghanistan. And since the Doha negotiation process started, they talked about forming an inclusive government. Instead, what we saw the Taliban do is appoint their own stalwarts to positions of almost every position of importance, and frame that and try to frame that as some kind of an inclusive government, because these people included ethnicities, including Tajiks and Uzbeks. Notably, there are no ministers, Hazara ministers, although there are at least 2 Hazara deputy ministers in the government. Another decision or broken promise that has been aroused a lot of anger and frustration amongst Afghans has been with regards to female rights, especially girls' right to, or women's rights to education. What has made these even worse is the Taliban's lack of willingness or capacity to explain these decisions to the Afghan people. We have seen more recently the Taliban attempting to explain these decisions, sometimes referring to, for example, we've heard that it's because of cultural sensitivities that girls' secondary schools remain closed for now, that there's cultural opposition. Other times it's framed as a religious reservations of religious scholars that need to be overcome. But by and large, decisions remain very opaque and indiscernible for many ordinary Afghans. Just speaking in terms of the interim government, you mentioned the Taliban have formed an interim government, and 1 year on, it's still very unclear. I think it's a bit of trying to have both their cake and eat it, in the sense that they want to have a government that's controlled by them, and that's fully within their they have the capacity to make whatever decision they want. And I think from the Taliban's perspective, that means monopolizing the whole government machinery, but at the same time not antagonizing the international community by forming a permanent government that's composed completely of the Taliban. And I think that might be one of the reasons why they've gone towards the interim framework. Another possible reason is also that the Taliban never really reached consensus on many of these fundamental decisions. The Taliban for 2 decades was so busy fighting an insurgency, they never really got together and thought about some of the more fundamentals of what a future government should look like, what are the key principles. And only during the Doha talks, I think this process began. And it was very slow and tedious, because for the Taliban, they needed to ensure enough buy-in for it to be so that it doesn't kind of challenge the cohesion of the movement. And the rapid military advance of the Taliban overtook the events, the kind of the discussions they were having. And I think they're still in that space where there's a lack of consensus within the Taliban on the direction. And with the lawyer Jirga, I think there was some kind of hope that the Taliban would be able to build a level of consensus. And there was rumors they might announce a permanent government, very much the same government being turned into a permanent one. But I think opposition and differences of opinion within the Taliban meant even that was not, that didn't eventuate. Looking at the future and coming more specifically to the question you posed, Laurel, I think there's a level of fear. The Taliban are very much have come to the conclusion that this is the type of government they want. They want an emirate. They want their white flag to be the national flag. They want the government machinery to be controlled by Taliban stalwarts, because they want to appease their own members and commanders, and there's a fear amongst them that people could defect from the movement and join some of the challengers to the current government, including the Islamic State's Khorasan province. And I think that's meant that they want to have that monopoly over power, but at the same time, they're fearful that if they announce this as a permanent composition, it will cement their isolation and turn them into the type of pariah state during the 1990s. And I think they do not want to return to that state. Lastly, I'll just add that I think the key challenge for the Taliban from ordinary Afghans' perspective is the inability to address challenges, whether it's political dissent. I think the Taliban really need to move from the idea that all dissent or all criticism of their government doesn't equate to opposition, and they do not need to or should suppress all forms of opposition. That's the kind of modus operandi we're seeing. And I think for the Taliban to evolve and go to things like constitutionalism and having a kind of judicial framework and with rights and responsibilities enshrined, they really need to move away from this paranoia that their government is being undermined by foreigners, and that any form of criticism to their governance is an attempt to undermine it and make it short-lived.
Thanks, Ibrahim. One of our listeners, Michelle Gehrig, picked up on the comment you made earlier about constructive criticism being allowed and asked if there are any examples of this type of criticism and Taliban reactions to them. I'm wondering, in light of what you just said, is it more that a certain amount of constructive criticism is allowed, or a certain amount of criticism is allowed if it's not too strong, simply for enabling some venting of grievances, or is there actually a dynamic of certain types of criticism being seriously considered and reacted to?
Uh, Perhaps I was being a bit too harsh on the Taliban when I made those comments. Perhaps I was not, but the reason I say this constructive criticism is because when you look at the Afghan media, local media, a lot of the time you will have someone who supports the Taliban or an official of the Taliban, but you'd have someone who's there to criticize the government. I mean, I recently saw a clip of a religious cleric saying, if you build a mosque from U.S. donor money, non-Muslims, then we should destroy the mosque and rebuild it with Afghan money. And the guy on the opposite side of the table said to him, well, the Islamic Emirate, which is the government the Taliban refer to themselves, receives a lot of donations and money through UN and other organizations to stabilize the economy. Does that mean we need to destroy the economy and rebuild it from the start? I cite this example to say that it's a very blurry situation when it comes to the media. We know some prominent critics of the government have been arrested or interned for days at times by the Taliban, including the Taliban's intelligence, the GDI, or General Director of Intelligence. Other times you will see people making quite harsh criticism of the government and continue to do so in the local media. So it's a bit of it's hard for me to define, to give a safe definition of this is what you can get away with when it comes to the media. But I think it's a bit of a blurry line, and the challenge for a lot of ordinary Afghans is, when do they cross that line and where do they need to stop?
Yeah. When it's all gray, you don't really know what the new rules are. There's a question that's come in from Arashi Keen about the recent killing of al-Qaeda leader Zawahiri. The question is, because he was found in Kabul, do the panel members see any chance for a new international intervention? I thought I would just answer this question quickly and see if others, if Ibraheem or Graeme, you have anything to add. My quick answer is no. I don't think this means there's any increased chance of an international intervention. To the contrary, I think from a Western perspective, this means because the number one loose end has now been snipped off when it comes to counterterrorism interests in Afghanistan, I think it means it's less likely that there will be attention in this area to Afghanistan rather than more likely. But I'm wondering if either of you have any differences of view with that.
Yeah, I noticed after the killing of Zawahiri, some of my friends who are associated with northern political factions immediately got in touch and wanted to know, if this had sort of changed the strategic calculus, and whether, international actors might be interested now in giving, guns or money to anti-Taliban factions. And despite the sort of flurry of questions, I had the same instinct that, I thought the answer was no. Some Western officials have told me the answer is no. But I think Ibraheem and I just published an essay in Foreign Affairs, and we certainly got some of these talking points into the most recent report, just sort of saying, listen, just because something seems like a far-fetched bad idea doesn't necessarily mean it won't at some point be embraced by Western policymakers. So it's worth kind of reminding them that it would be a bad idea to start a new civil war. And then, from there, spooling out the policy alternatives, because we don't think that it is a good idea to just ignore the various security challenges surrounding Afghanistan. And that maybe there are ways of, carefully and in a calibrated way engaging with the Taliban on security issues as an alternative to taking unilateral action.
Right. And I mean, I would just note the fact that Zawahiri was found in Afghanistan is not genuinely a new fact. I mean, it was already the assessment of Western governments openly and others that there were remnants of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and that Zawahiri was probably somewhere in Afghanistan. Now, perhaps it was a surprise that he was right there in the center of Kabul, but I wouldn't expect the analysis of the problem or the policy about what to do about it to change materially because of a specific location he was found. The fact is, it was already known that this was a problem, and now there's this most important loose end that has been cleaned up.
Yeah, people always
yeah,
ask me if we had to do last minute rewriting of the security report when Zawahiri was killed, and the answer was like actually not as much as you might expect, because Ibraheem had already done voluminous research on the sort of variety of militant groups, including Al Qaeda, that do remain.
Right. There's an interesting question that's come in from Suzanne Schroeder that Ibraheem, maybe you can go first on this one, and it relates to some of the points that you already referenced about the Taliban. The question is, for 10 years, we heard that the younger generation of Taliban fighters were more radical than their older counterparts who had fought the Soviets. Regarding the internal differences over girls' secondary education, how do these divisions break down along ideological and generational lines? And that's, this is certainly an analysis that I had heard many times, this idea that the younger fighters were more radical than the older, more senior people in the Taliban. And, sometimes this was even a line that you would hear from Taliban figures as be careful, don't alienate us, because we've got this younger cohort to manage and we don't want to alienate them. But I'm wondering, Ibraheem, do you see that generational divide being real? Do you see it as something that has evolved over the last year? And does it relate to some specific policy decisions that the Taliban have made over the last year, in particular regarding girls' access to education?
Let me try to answer that as briefly as I can, just because I can see there's a lot of questions pouring in. I think the Taliban is a collection of individuals from different backgrounds and different geographies and whatnot do have differing opinions. I think when it comes to the Taliban, the older generation, when we want to look at it from a generational perspective, the older generation is more conservative on the social spheres, whereas the younger generation is, Afghanistan has changed over the last 2 decades. We have heard this time and again, and the Taliban don't appear to have been immune to that change. A lot of the younger generation are socially more flexible compared to the older generation of the Taliban. At the same time, I think in terms of outlook, it is the older generation that has kept the Taliban firmly as a organization which has limited its ambitions to Afghanistan rather than having a globalist. I think if some of the younger generation had its way with it, perhaps the Taliban would not be this. We would not view the Taliban the same way we do today. It's because the older generation, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight and experience, has decided that the Taliban as a movement will not be a transnational movement and it would be limited to Afghanistan. So I think the generational gap between the Taliban goes both ways in many different ways.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's not clear cut. There's not a clear cut divide as to what does more conservative or what does more radical mean. Thanks for that insight. We've got a question from Piotr Kurzin about Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan, referencing the attacks that have occurred, especially in the first months of Taliban governance. But I think we've seen some really tragic incidents since then as well. Could both of you speak a little bit about what the risk is from Islamic State Khorasan to the Taliban, both from not just from a security perspective as a challenge they have to manage, but also from a governance perspective? And is there any connection here between the threat from ISK and the potential for Al Qaeda to regain influence? That's part of the question, whether there's any linkage there. Graeme, do you want to try this one first and then over to Ibraheem?
Yeah, Ibrahim's really the master here, so I'll try to be very short. But yeah, Piotr, hi. You raise a good point. And this is just something, it goes back since before ISKP existed in Afghanistan. I mean, the last time I was in those eastern mountains in Asadabad, it was, years ago, almost a decade ago now, researching a crisis group report. And at that time, people told me stories about how the Taliban in the 1990s had a really hard time securing those far reaches of the eastern mountains because they faced a lot of resistance from Salafist militants. There are people there who just sort of fundamentally disagreed with the Taliban's view of Islam. And so that's why, when I've been reading Ibraheem's excellent analysis of the, more recent situation with ISKP, I've just been sort of unsurprised, I guess, that the Taliban have struggled so hard. But Ibrahim, why don't you keep us up to date on this?
Thank you for the excellent summary, Graeme. I'll briefly start off by saying the Security Challenges report we've recently published kind of dives into this issue in more detail and looks at the strategy of Islamic State Khorasan and what's it trying to achieve. If I was to try to summarize it as briefly as I can, I would say the Islamic State Khorasan really is attempting to place itself as the new challenger to the political order. And to do that, they are framing the Taliban as corrupted, who have kind of made a deal with the US in the Doha negotiations, where now they are protecting Washington from pure Islamism, as it were. And I think that the strategy revolves around ensuring they survive any crackdown by the Taliban. And the Taliban have certainly cracked down very brutally when it comes to the Islamic State, but also attempting to leech anyone that's upset with the Taliban, whether it's Taliban young members or commanders who might be upset with the direction of the government or the composition or personal reasons that they didn't get a position commensurate with what they had done, or whether it's other jihadist groups that are currently allied with the Taliban, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's TTP. I think that's the long-term game that Islamic State is posing. The Taliban have cracked down on it quite brutally. In some cases, they have temporarily dismantled Islamic State in parts of the country, but ISKP has proven a resilient opponent. And as Graeme said, if we look at the ideological differences between the two, this threat will likely continue for at least the medium term, if not the long term. Al-Qaeda, it's difficult to say, but I think it'll be a game changer if Al-Qaeda chooses the next leader who's not based in Afghanistan who doesn't subsequently then come to Afghanistan to seek refuge. It might rid of the Taliban. There's a famous saying attributed to Mullah Omar. I don't know if it's correct or not. Mullah Omar apparently said that Al-Qaeda is like a bone stuck in his throat. He can't spit it out and he can't swallow it. And I think if the leadership of Al-Qaeda, the top leadership, was elected somewhere outside Afghanistan, it might get rid of that fishbone with which the Taliban have struggled for nearly 3 decades now. Thanks.
Thanks very much. We've got a comment, more of a comment than a question here, but I still want to surface this one from Zaman Sultani about disagreeing with the notion that the Taliban takeover has brought security. And the comment says it rather institutionalized fear, insecurity into the minds of women, children, men. In most cases, the Taliban soldiers act as police, prosecutor, judge. What security if people cannot find? So one thing I just want to say, and then open it to you, Ibraheem, and then Graeme, if there's anything you want to add, is, I do think it's important to highlight that there are so many different experiences by different people. This is as true in Afghanistan as it is anywhere in the world. And, what does security mean? What does order mean? What does stability mean? I mean, these are very contested concepts. I think I want to just be clear that when we're writing about how the security picture has changed in Afghanistan, any of our sort of positive comments about that are about reduction in the level of violence. I mean, it is simply the matter of fewer people losing their lives. I'll just say my own personal view is that there is inherent positivity in fewer people losing their lives and more people being able to till the soil, send their children who are allowed to go to school safely without to move about without fear of death. Now, that's not the only good that there is in society by any means, and I'm not purporting in any way to impose, any of my own personal views on what others' experiences are of what they value. But I just want to be clear that when we're talking about positive changes in the security picture, we're talking in a very simple and, not to be simplistic about it, but simple way about reduction in levels of violence, and that is important. But that's not to say that there aren't other aspects of the security picture and of people's daily lives that aren't extremely important as well. So Ibraheem and Graeme, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that or comment on that comment.
I mean, I think it's an important comment. Yeah, absolutely. And, Crisis Group is a peace organization. And this is something we struggle with in a lot of our work, because what is peace, after all? And it's easy to get sort of lost in a complicated discussion of positive peace and negative peace. I think it is still important to count things, because when you count things, you're not just reducing people to statistics, you're actually putting value on human lives. And so I think it's important to note that, at the height of this conflict, it ranked as the deadliest conflict on the planet Earth. By one count, 30,000, by another count, 40,000 people dying per year directly in the conflict. The UN numbers on displacement are also really, really important, because in a bad month, we previously had upwards of 200,000 people displaced, forced to flee their homes because of the violence in a single month. And now, those numbers are way down, 1,000, 2,000, when things get hot in some of the northern mountains. So, it's we have to value all of these experiences. And certainly, this is one of the reasons why we've been back on the ground, hiring female researchers, why we're looking into the ways that, the Taliban handle governance issues for men, for women, for ethnic minorities, for religious minorities, for tribal minorities. These things really do matter in the different ways that people experience their country. But I think, speaking personally as someone who has been bombed and shot at and rocketed and mortared and RPG'd in Afghanistan, I think it does feel different when things aren't going bang like that. I don't know, Ibraheem, what do you think?
Thank you. Let me just add a few brief comments as well. Unfortunately, the sad reality is that Afghanistan has gone through decades of conflict, and it has really polarized society. I think at the vanguard of the political class, we have two different classes which all see themselves as irreconcilable with one another. On one hand, you have the vanguard of the Islamists, who are very much opposed to Western forms of governance, and then on the other hand, you have people who cherish the Western democratic heritage and want that outlook for Afghanistan. And unfortunately, the sad reality is that every time one has been on top, the other has seen itself being persecuted. If you talk to many of the Taliban sympathizers in Kabul, some of whom were killed in unclaimed assassinations, others were arrested, they would talk to you about these security situations in a very different way. They would say, now there's security and freedom for them, but in the past they were persecuted. But on the flip side of the coin, of course, there was a political class in Kabul and parts of Afghanistan, many parts of Afghanistan, which is now the one being persecuted. So it's not to, as Laurel pointed out, when we talk about better security, we are not diminishing the suffering that many of these people face, but it's to admit that there is a level of violence in the country. The amount of bombs and bullets going off in the country, they have reduced. I'll say that a lot of the time when I speak to locals in Afghanistan, particularly outside of Kabul and the provinces, to be perfectly honest, you don't hear them delving into political systems. This is better or that is better. They generally will see any government, whether when you ask them to compare the current government with the previous, they would talk about it in a sense of a distant, remote capital that is unaware of their local problems. So it's not, I don't think in Afghanistan, outside the capital of Kabul, there is a lot of concern with the political type of system. People just want the government to give them enough facilitation so that they can go about their lives. But let me just end again by saying what Laurel said, that when we talk about security, we mean a very specific thing rather than saying that there isn't injustices going on in Afghanistan right now.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, it's always true that the vast majority of the population is not in any form of the political class, but they're the ones who suffer from that kind of contestation between the alternative versions of what's the superior political class. We've got a question about TTP here. Taliban, Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban, and how we look at the Taliban hosting TTP. Of course, there was some, let's just say, allowing of TTP presence in Afghanistan by the previous government too. So it's not necessarily a new thing for Afghan authorities of whatever stripe to be trying to use their relationships with TTP in different ways vis-a-vis Pakistan. But under the current dispensation, the question is, how do we look at the Taliban hosting the TTP? What does this mean in terms of relations with Pakistan? The specific question here is whether it means that the Taliban are violating the Doha deal. But I think maybe to speak a little more broadly about this would be interesting. What does it mean in terms of the Taliban's relationships with both the West and with Pakistan, that it's now quite open that they are enabling TTP to be present in Afghanistan? Ibraheem, do you want to go first?
Because the question is addressed to you, Laurel, I'm quite happy for you to answer it.
I was being very, I was cleverly working around the fact that it was addressed to me. I mean, I will just say, you know, to me, questions as to whether the Taliban are technically violating the Doha deal or not are not particularly relevant. If the United States finds it convenient to say that they're violating the Doha deal because that reinforces a policy message, then they will say that. But there's no enforcement of the Doha deal that is feasible. And so it's not, I don't think it's particularly relevant to U.S. policymaking whether this is technically a violation or not. But I do think there's some interesting points as to what does this mean in terms of Taliban relationship with Pakistan, an obviously important neighbor. Over to you, Ibraheem.
Thank you. On the Doha deal, I think the Doha deal has been it's been accompanied by incrimination since the day it was signed. The Taliban also complained that the US hasn't fulfilled their part of the bargain. I was listening to Zalmay Khalilzad where he said both parties haven't actually fulfilled the deal. The US promised to remove sanctions from Taliban leaders, and recently Anas Haqqani was giving an interview where he was the Doha agreement came up, and he said, well, the US unilaterally extended the deadline, they delayed the prison releases and whatnot. And I mean, the Taliban CT breaches of the Doha agreement are quite clear to everyone. I think no matter how you interpret it, no matter how flexibly you interpret the Doha agreement, it couldn't conceivably justify having Zawahiri in Kabul, presuming that the Taliban were aware of him being Kabul, which on the face of it does look like was the case. In terms of what it means for the relationships between Pakistan and Taliban, I think Pakistan and Afghanistan face a number of issues, some of which are historical. The border between the two countries has always been a bone of contention between the two. And recently we have seen, since the Taliban have come to power, we have seen some of these border clashes flaring up at times over the fencing. Recently, we saw in Badakhshan where the Taliban kind of pushed back Pakistani security forces because they believed they had impeached on what was they considered to be Afghan land. Then you had the challenge of the TTP. I think on the face of it, again, I would say I want to be a bit cautious and kind of give a bit of benefit of the doubt when I'm making these claims. But the TTP appears to be quite active in Afghanistan, and since the Taliban's takeover, appears to have rejuvenated, and it's caused serious security challenges for Pakistan. On the other hand, when you do speak with the Taliban, a lot of the time they will make the opposite claim. They will say that ISKP is being, it's a threat coming across the border. I think the Taliban officials publicly have hinted at this several times, and privately, very openly, do say that they think that ISKP might be, the Pakistan might be using it as a leverage against Afghanistan, and that's why they want to keep TTP as a leverage as well. The other big challenge is ISKP was formed historically from TTP members, and I think the Taliban are the relationships between these two groups in some ways persist, and ideologies are sufficiently aligned, although the two on the opposite end of the spectrum, one's allied with the Taliban, the other's fighting it. But I think the Taliban are fearful that if they push the TTP too hard, it will cause a lot of them to defect. I do apologize. I think I'm going over the time limit, so I'm going to stop there.
No worries. No, that's really helpful analysis and insights there. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn to Graeme for the last question that we will consider here. We've got one in that refers to the U.S. Blockage of $7 billion in foreign assets that had belonged to Afghanistan's central bank. And the question is specifically referring to a recent Wall Street Journal article about the seizure of those assets and reported suspension of U.S. talks with the Taliban over the disposition of those funds after the killing of al-Qaeda leader Zawahiri in Kabul. Graeme, this is a topic that you have been following closely, the question to do with those frozen assets and whether there's any way to negotiate the release of at least some of them in order to restore functionality of the Afghan central bank. And I know you've been following closely the US Taliban talks about that. So over to you for any comments on that.
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning of this conversation, Crisis Group put out a report in December urging the international community to ease some of the economic restrictions on Afghanistan in order to help with recovery. And one of those key recommendations we made was that there should be a sort of a phased unfreezing of the more than $9 billion actually in central bank reserves that are held internationally. 7 of those in the United States and about 2 in Europe. And of all the recommendations we made, that's the one that's been, I think, the hardest for the United States and its allies to put into motion. There have been these ongoing negotiations that you alluded to, led by the U.S. State Department in conversation primarily with the Afghanistan Bank, the Central Bank of Afghanistan, and also with the Taliban-controlled Foreign Ministry. And those talks have been frustrating, I think, for both sides. The Taliban are essentially saying, what right do you have to freeze this money, back to the central bank? And the American position is that, look, this is not the Taliban's money. We don't have a lot of confidence in the, sort of technocratic capacity now of the central bank after a bunch of the officials evacuated, and the Americans say they are very concerned about the anti-money laundering and the capacity of the office within the central bank that was meant to counter the financing of terrorism, for example. And those concerns have deepened after the recent discovery of Zawahiri living on the Taliban's doorstep in Kabul. That being said, after the Zawahiri killing, state and treasury officials have told us that those talks are still on. They still have hope to create some kind of a mechanism where the central bank funds could be deposited into some form of a trust fund or other holding mechanism, possibly in Switzerland, and that would allow for the slow rehabilitation of the central bank, which is so vital to making sure that the currency has value, making sure that there's enough cash liquidity for imports. I mean, these are the nuts and bolts of how Afghans eat. And that is very important when you're talking about a population, half of which is on the brink of starvation, according to the UN, 20 million people on the brink of starvation. So, these very complicated discussions about, macroeconomic stability, are actually life or death for ordinary Afghans, especially as we get into the winter. And there's a lot of frustration, as I say, on both sides. I think with respect to my friends Jess and Margay from the Wall Street Journal, they might have slightly misunderstood. In fact, in the last hour, I think I've confirmed that their story is not entirely correct, because they're quoting U.S. envoy Tom West saying that the $7 billion held by the United States will not be returned to the Afghan central bank. But that's really not what's under discussion. What's under discussion, or at least being proposed by the American side, is putting the money in some kind of safekeeping in Europe and using it to gradually bring the central bank back to life. So it's complicated, but this stuff is really vital to getting the Afghan economy back on its feet, and we'll continue to follow it.
Thanks, Graeme, and thanks for bringing this back to that really crucial point that you started with, which is the really devastating economic and humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, and the need for continued focus on that and attention by Afghan authorities foremost, and by the international community as well, to doing whatever they can to restore economic activity and ensure that people have food to eat, the basics of life. I want to thank you, Ibraheem and Graeme, for your really excellent comments here today and answers to questions, and thank all the listeners, and especially those who submitted really good and thoughtful questions here. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but we got to as many as we could. And I just want to let everyone know that a recording of this Twitter space will be available on Twitter. So if you came in partway through and you want to listen to the beginning, it will be available there. And do feel free to let others know about its availability. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to hosting another one of these soon. Bye, everyone.